wild supposition, but is completely in line with what we saw in the midterms a year ago and what we've seen in 2019. I'm running for president for a very simple reason. I think the government of the United States is broken, that it's been purchased by corporations, that it's really not trying to address the needs of ordinary American citizens, and it's not. And so that if we want any of the progressive policy prescriptions that people on the Democratic debate stage have been talking about, whether it's healthcare or education or gun safety legislation or the Green New Deal or immigration and on, we're not getting it. Those aren't new problems. We're not going to get them until we break the stranglehold that corporations have on our government. And for the last 10 years, that's what I've been basically doing, putting together coalitions of ordinary American citizens to take on unchecked corporate power. And for 10 years, those coalitions have been winning. I have taken on the oil companies. I have taken in California. I have closed $1 billion tax loophole in California and given the money to the public schools. I have taken on drug companies. I took on tobacco, which had won 17 times in a row. We got a $2 a pack cigarette tax and gave the money to Medi-Cal, which is healthcare for the lowest income Californians. I've taken on utilities. There's no doubt in my mind that the only way we're going to get back to government of, by, and for the people is to take it back. I also, as Julia referenced, started one of the largest grassroots organizations in the United States, which is Next Gen America. And it does two things. It's a grassroots organization. One is it organizes voting by young people, people under 35. In 2018, Next Gen America did the largest youth voter mobilization in American history. We were in 38 Republican congressional districts. We more than doubled the turnout of young people from the previous midterms. 33 of the districts flipped. When you think about what drives change in the United States, there are two models. One is that we're going to persuade moderates in the middle that Democrats are just like Republicans, only nicer. That's about 2% of Americans. Between 1.25% of Americans don't vote in elections. They're overwhelmingly Democratic. And the question is, those are people you don't have to persuade anything. They already agree. What they have to be persuaded of is that the system works at all and it's worth their time to vote. And so what we've done is first with young people, which is the largest, young people are the largest generation in American history, bigger than the boomers, most diverse generation in American history, and most progressive. People under 30 in the United States vote Democratic over Republican 72 to 28%, 44-point spread. So the real question, and the other thing I said, we do two things Next Gen America. One is youth voter mobilization. The other is we go door to door. We started an organization with 7 national labor unions called For Our Future. We go door to door to sporadic voters to talk to them about their issues and to try and convince them to vote. In the last 2 election cycles, we've hit more than 25 million doors. So it really is an idea, both in terms of the work that I've done, in terms of taking on corporations directly, and I gave you a very short summary of all the work that has entailed, but it's a lot more than I'm saying. And in terms of the grassroots organization, the point is to push power away from concentrated elite control and down to the people, to the grassroots. And that's really what I was doing with the need to impeach petition. Over 8 million people signed a petition basically saying we need to impeach and remove this president. And the point was that for them, it wasn't that we were going to make an argument that was going to change people's minds. What politicians respond to is votes. That's 8 million people telling their elected representatives, you should do this or we won't vote for you. And that's actually, I think, what dragged Washington, D.C. to go forward with the idea that we should hold the most corrupt president in American history accountable. So I've been doing that. And the last thing I'll say about this is this: if you think I'm right, and I've spent a long time thinking about this, about why this government is broken, and if you believe that it is because it's been purchased by corporations, you should know I am talking about structural change, 12-year term limits for Congress people and senators, and direct democracy, a referendum, a national referendum, the way we have it in 26 states, so that the people can pass laws. But the real question for Americans is, if you think that's right, you have to ask who's willing to make change. Is it going to be someone from the outside who's been doing this successfully for a decade, or will it be someone from inside the Beltway changing from within? And I can tell you, in history, it's always been people from the outside who are willing to shake things up. I do want to take a second and talk about a little bit about myself. Julia was very kind in her description and accurate. I started a business and ran it for 30 years.
You got two or what?
I built a big, I started a business from nothing with no money from my parents, one room, built it up, took the giving pledge to give away the bulk of my assets, of my money, while I'm alive, to good causes, and started organizing these coalitions. And, you know, people think of me as being a rich person, and that's how I'm described in the press. But what Julia said about my family is really true. That is not the description of people who are fancy billionaires. In fact, my parents were Depression-era World War II babies who thought that you give at least as much back to America as you get, that is a critical way of justifying your life. And they also felt, my father felt, after prosecuting Nazi war criminals, that a huge part of life was standing up for what's right very early. That in fact, unless you do that, then evil can really flourish, as it did in Germany in the 30s. And that's a big reason why, in fact, I started Need to Impeach, was the idea that unless you push back against corruption at the very heart of your society, that it can flourish and go to a place that no one ever imagined in the first place. One of the things that you should know about me, and I know there's a question that will probably come up on this, but I am the only person running for president on either side of the aisle who will say that climate is my #1 priority. You know, I've said I will declare a state of emergency on day one and use the emergency powers of the presidency. I will do it from the standpoint of environmental justice. Over 10 years of fighting on climate and winning, I have always started with environmental justice, with the communities in America where you can't breathe the air or drink the water safely. If you understand environmentalism in the United States, those are the communities that have the most environmental sensitivity, and in fact have been leaders in every part of our environmental movement. The other things I want to say are this: you can't do this. I'm speaking to Americans abroad. This is not an issue that we can solve within the 50 states of the United States. This is a specifically global problem that requires a global solution and American leadership. And if America's not going to lead on this, it really isn't going to happen. I think we could see that in Madrid, that unless America leads, there isn't going to be the progress necessary on this, given the short time frame. I wouldn't declare a state of emergency if it weren't an emergency. But we also can't go to other countries around the world on climate unless we're actively and urgently putting our own house in order. So when you think about how can this work, and you look and see about where the carbon emissions are coming from, unless the United States can credibly go to China and India and Brazil and Turkey and Poland and say, we are getting our house in order, we need you to get your house in order, and we'll share technology, we'll share the ability to get this done with you, I don't think we have any credibility. And it really can't happen. The last thing I want to say on climate is this: we have to do it. We can do it. I mean, I've spent 10 years studying this. We have the technology and the capability to arrest our climate crisis. We can do it, and we can do it in a way, and I believe the way I've described it, that I've proposed to solve this, does it in a way that creates millions of net, well-paid union jobs across the United States. We basically have to rebuild the United States on an accelerated basis. And guess what that means? A lot of jobs, a lot of high-paying union jobs across the country. And we also can do it in a way that cleans up our air and water. You know, people don't talk about it, but Americans are being poisoned across the country in terms of air and water, and it's low-income communities, and it's Black and brown communities, and we can address those issues very directly. And in addition, we can rebuild our relationship with the rest of the world and our moral leadership around the world. This isn't happening without our rearranging our relationship with other countries and reestablishing the idea that we're a value-driven country, that we can be a trusted partner, that our word is good, and that what we're pushing for is something that is better for people around the world, that we are the country that we were set out to be over 200 years ago. Last thing I want to say is this, and then I would like to take questions. We know what Mr. Trump, if he's not thrown out of office, is going to say, and we know what the Republicans will say if he is thrown out of office, because they only have one move. And here's Mr. Trump's move. I'm a criminal. I despise 80% of you. 80% of you don't like me, but you have no choice but to vote for me, because the Democrats don't know anything about economics, and the economy will tank within 15 minutes of my leaving office. That's his actual campaign. He's already started saying that. It's obvious that that's what he's going to say. And he'll throw in some hateful stuff, I promise you, in terms of divisive and racist language around immigration and other things. But basically, that's his whole pitch. That was his pitch. It continues to be his pitch on impeachment, which is, you can't throw me out of office, the economy will tank. We need somebody who's a Democrat. I don't know where all the people on this phone call reside, but some of you for sure reside in the United Kingdom. And we can see very clearly the idea that somebody, a right-wing Boris Johnson, can do very well if progressives are not organized, and if they don't put somebody forward who is perceived as responsible and adult. And I don't think there's any question, but that given what I described Mr. Trump's campaign is going to be like, that Democrats need to have a candidate who can go toe-to-toe with him on the economy, who can point out that he's a fake businessman. He actually played a businessman on a reality TV show. He actually failed as a businessman, and he's a fake steward of the economy. The things, he actually has been a terrible steward of the economy, between the tax plan, which is the worst piece of economic legislation I've ever seen, the worst, and his trade war, which is a direct attack on Americans, specifically farmers and manufacturing companies in the United States of America, two of his actual political strongholds, who he's just ravaging. So, and I happen to be the person who for 30 years building a business had to be able to think about what creates growth and prosperity. And as an international business person and investor, had to understand what drives success in an economy, whether it's the United States or the United Kingdom or Brazil or Singapore or whatever. So we're gonna have to have somebody, and I really believe, I'm gonna put out an economic paper this morning, a policy paper, and we really do, we're gonna have to have somebody who can go after Mr. Trump and win on his, go after him on his strength and win. Because I think Democrats are starting to realize, oh my goodness, not only is this an incredibly important election, but it's one we can lose. And we really can't afford to lose this election. And the last thing I'll say is this, look, I view Americans as having rights that are not recognized by the Constitution. The Constitution was written in the 18th century, and we're in the 21st century. So there are things that they never contemplated that I think everybody in this country recognizes or should recognize as the rights of an American, the right to affordable health care. At this point in history, Americans have a right to affordable health care, right to a quality public education, starting with pre-K, the right to clean air and clean water. No one gets to poison you. You know, we tend to use fancy language like pollution, but actually the point is, does a company get to poison you so they can make more money? No, they don't. The right to a living wage. There has been a 40-year war on working families in the United States, going after specifically organized labor and unions, but really taking all of the increased income for the very richest Americans and the biggest corporations. The statistics are horrible. But when you actually go around the country and see what that means for working people, the facts are absolutely painful, cruel, and terrible. And so, and the right to a fair vote. I mean, we have seen the Republican Party actively, in an organized, intentional, and effective way, strike people off the rolls and suppress votes specifically of hundreds of thousands or millions of African Americans. It's hard to believe, but it's true. And that doesn't even reach to the gerrymandering, to the refusal to protect the electing process against hacking from hostile foreign countries that they believe will help them. You know, there's been an attack on the equal vote of American citizens that's shameful. But my point is this: if we get back government of, by, and for the people, if we break this corporate stranglehold on our government, we're going to get all those rights. That's going to be foundational for American life, that in fact, every person feels confident that those things are secure and they're the foundation for their creating their own lives. And so I look at this as we have two real challenges: take back the government and solidify, control the climate crisis, to get that under control in a real way, which we absolutely critically have to do for life on Earth. I mean, it sounds so grandiose, but we need to save the world physically. The United States of America needs to lead an international effort to save the world. And if we do that, we're going to be in the best position of any people in history, and we will create meaning in our country, reinvent really the meaning of being Americans, and take on the biggest challenge and succeed. And that will give meaning to everyone's life, to the country, and it will be, the rebirth of of America. So with that, Leah.
Yes, well, thank you so much. It's a lot to unpack. And the very first thing I wanted to mention is that we are so with you in terms of your voter mobilization work. It's something that we are also deeply involved in, both in, getting out the vote around the world is incredibly important because it's such an untapped market. And people just don't know they can vote, and they don't know their vote counts. So it's very similar to your efforts with millennials. We really appreciate the work that you're doing, and we're really excited to do that again abroad in 2020. So
let me say thank you for that. Let me also say that if you would, we need people to sign the petition so we can be on the ballot for Americans abroad today.
That's a really good point. And that's something that, Amanda, have you read out that address yet?
No, we hadn't read it out yet, but it is in the chat, and we'll be sure, I can post it again now, and then we'll also be reminding people about that at the end of the call as well.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And then also thank you so much for all of that you said about the climate. Our first question is, of course, on the climate, because it's such an important issue for us. Alex, would you like to take that one?
Absolutely. So this question comes from both our Hispanic and Progressive caucuses. As you spoke to this just earlier, the climate crisis is a significant contributing factor to many conflicts and refugee situations around the globe, putting Americans abroad and all global citizens at risk due to political insecurity. You spoke quite a bit about how the US will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and how we can lead the global effort to avoid catastrophic climate breakdown. But to sort of bring it to a more finer point, what do you think a US president in early 2021 can do independently of the cooperation of Congress or other countries to respond to this crisis?
So that is a very fair question. And that's exactly why I've been saying I would declare a state of emergency on day one, Alex. Because the president has emergency powers, and they use it a lot in things that aren't true national emergencies. But I think the president, under those circumstances, can do things like determine how energy is generated. You know, the equivalent of setting renewable portfolio standards, where you determine how fast you move away from fossil fuel-based energy. How, you know, the miles per gallon rules can be set by the president, so that in fact you're forcing the adoption of EVs much sooner, of electric vehicles much sooner, and compelling the end of the true gas guzzlers. I think you can put through building codes in terms of energy efficiency. The US government is the biggest customer for fossil fuels in the world and energy. So the buying power of the government can change. And also, we lease out our national land for, you know, for people to dig coal and to search for oil and gas. And we can change that too. There is just an enormous number of levers that a president can use immediately on day one, both for the substantive change and for the symbolic message that this is a state of emergency and we're going to do it. And, you know, the question is going to be, can we get this going through that fast enough? I think the basic way that I think about dealing with climate is clean up your energy generation, electrify everything, get energy efficiency. That's been the mantra. But of course, that doesn't include the kinds of things that we would have to do with regards to agriculture, specifically with the way that we raise crops and animals. It also doesn't bring up the partnership that we would have to start with rural America in terms of sequestering carbon, which is something that we could get going on immediately. And it doesn't deal with the way that we're going to have to change manufacturing to get rid of, you know, greenhouse gas emissions. So it's comprehensive. But the point is, we can get going on day one on all those fronts, because none of them can you snap your finger and say, okay, fine, now we're all renewables next week. You know, there are huge investment and building programs to get to a place where we can be carbon neutral. But the good news is we have the technology to do it, and clean energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy. So for all the people who say, oh, it's going to cost so much money, the answer is actually no, it's going to save so much money. We're going to actually do this in a way that's going to make us better off, better employed, and better paid.
Well, thank you so much. That's really, we love drilling down into the specifics, and that's very interesting for us. And speaking of specifics, we have a more specific question around an issue that's really important for Americans abroad. Amanda, do you want to take that one?
Yep. Thanks, Julia, and thank you, Mr. Steyer. This question is a concern of many of our members, and it's on the subject of immigration. Executive orders such as the one exploiting the term public charge demonstrate that our current immigration system was founded in a shameful era of discrimination and bigotry, and that family members of Americans abroad are allowed entry to the U.S. only through a patchwork of fragile band-aids and weakly defended interpretations. Would you restore the principle of family reunification? And how would your plan for immigration improve the situation for spouses, partners, and relatives of Americans living abroad, like us, who wish to return with their families?
So Amanda, that is, obviously American immigration is a political football, which has been designed by the current president really to foster a racial conversation and to vilify non-white people wanting to come to the United States. And that is the context in which every one of those questions needs to be answered, because of course I'm in favor, I have a completely different attitude towards immigration and towards families than this president does, because what he's really talking about is race. And what he really is trying to do is to prevent non-white people from coming to the United States of America. Whereas in fact, my attitude about immigration is completely different. Obviously, I don't want to commit crimes against humanity the way this administration has chosen to do in order to terrorize people and prevent them from being, and make them scared to even think about coming to the United States. I don't want to separate families. I mean, they've obviously gone to the point of separating very, very young kids or babies from their parents. I think the idea of family reunification through immigration is something that, how could you be against that? So to a very real extent, when I think about immigration, the whole thing that they've been doing about trying to terrorize people and to prevent people from seeking asylum, which is an international right, and to break international law and break the laws of humanity, obviously I'm completely against that. Then there's the idea of the people who are already here, the 11 to 13 million people. I believe in comprehensive immigration reform, giving them legal status and a path to citizenship. And in terms of immigration policy, of course we want to control immigration, but we also have to understand we need immigrants. And family reunification should be a critical part of how we think about people coming to the United States. How could you possibly want to have a separated family and spouses apart from each other for years? How could that possibly make sense? So I'm a believer in immigration, that it's important for the United States, that it's a source of strength, that people around the world think the United States is a great place to move to, and so therefore we get the benefit of their energy. And I believe that a huge part of that is making sure that families are protected through this process. And I think that the real issue here has been that every single sort of thoughtful, compassionate, objective attitude towards immigration has been intentionally clouded by a very emotional appeal to racism. And once you can take that away, you can get back to a much more humane, thoughtful, effective immigration policy without the histrionics about being invaded by brown people from the South, which is really the issue that is causing your life, or causing the lives of Americans abroad to be so complicated and scary.
Thank you so much for that. And our next question is also a very Americans Abroad focused question. And it's important for many people on the call today. You'll actually see in the chat box that several people have asked questions around this point. It's one we ask all candidates, and it's about FATCA. Regulatory guidance from the Treasury Department could really alleviate the harm of FATCA, which affects Americans abroad in our banking and our investments and the way that we live and work abroad. Will you commit to direct the Treasury Department to study and then implement new guidance that will provide relief to ordinary Americans living abroad who are demonstrably not evading taxes?
Yes. I know this is a big issue.
It is.
I tried to do some work to figure it out. I think it is a complicated issue, but if we can do this in a way that's fair and revenue neutral, yes, obviously the way this has been written is bedeviling people and making it incredibly complicated and onerous to obey American tax regulations in a way that is, it's interfering with people's lives. And that's exactly the kind of thing that should be simplified and dealt with as fast as possible by an effective administration.
Thank you so much. We have a follow-up question, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Steyer. That's great to hear. And as a follow-up question, most Americans living abroad think that the time has come for residency-based taxation, the principle guiding all other countries' tax systems, and a fix for numerous unjust burdens on Americans living and working abroad. There are bipartisan revenue-neutral proposals to implement RBT that include robust provisions to protect the law from abuse by tax evaders. All we need is a moment of leadership to get this done. Will you be that leader?
Yes, I will. Look, let me say this, Amanda. I am not an expert on this. I know enough to be dangerous. I also know that every single thing you're saying makes total sense to me. And I'm also someone who, as a business person, has spent literally decades watching how complicated regulations can have unintended consequences for people without, without actually bringing the results that people started want in the first place. So everything that you're saying makes a ton of sense to me. And the idea that America would take the time to solve this problem for Americans living abroad in a way that's fair and takes away the burden makes complete sense. I know God will end up being in the details, that you've got to get it right, but that's the whole point of an effective government, is that you look at a complicated situation and understand why the unintended consequences have occurred and remove them so we can end up with a fair system for everybody.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate that, the answer. And we have another Americans Abroad question that, Alex, go for it.
Sure. In a 2019 survey of Americans living abroad, Democrats Abroad found that many of our members cited their reason for living abroad as affordable health care. These numbers include healthcare refugees, those who cannot afford to return to live in the US due to the high cost of healthcare and the threat of bankruptcy due to illness. Under your healthcare plan, will Americans currently abroad at all income levels and states of health be able to return to live in the US and receive quality, affordable, accessible healthcare for their families at reasonable costs and without the threat of bankruptcy?
So Alex, I started in my opening statement saying that affordable healthcare is a right for Americans in the 21st century. I mean, that wasn't contemplated when they wrote the Constitution over 200 years ago, but it's actually, in my opinion, it's a right. We pay way too much for healthcare in the United States of America, and much more than other countries. And that is proof that my basic thesis that this government has been purchased by corporations is true. For us to get affordable healthcare in this country for every American as a right, which I believe it is, we're going to have to break the stranglehold of drug companies, of insurance companies, and of private hospitals. And so that there is going to be, when I said there were two challenges, one is taking back this government that basically corporations have bought it. Those are some of the key corporations that have bought it. And you can look at actual laws that give them the right to extort American citizens and overcharge us really, really dramatically compared to other countries. And so we have absolutely got to end that. And yes, that will be something that is a critical part of what I do, because healthcare is life. People live overseas because they have issues they have to contend with, and they can't afford to do it in the United States of America because we're getting ripped off by the same healthcare companies that are actually providing a lot of the services abroad at much lower cost. And we have got to get the same costs into our system that other countries have. So yes, that is a critical function and an outcome of breaking this corporate stranglehold. But people can promise you any system they want. And this is why I'm running for government, for president. If they can promise you any system they want, the question is, can they deliver it? And the only way they can deliver on the healthcare promise, and I happen to be a government option person, that you have to have a government option that, where you use the power of the government to drive down the costs of insurance and drugs and private hospitals. And you ruthlessly push that down on behalf of the American people because they've been ruthlessly exploited. But my point is, to get that, or to get Medicare for all, we're going to have to break the corporate stranglehold. And so do I have a program that will definitely succeed in what you're saying? 100%. Are we going to have to break the corporate stranglehold in order to do it? We are. Because there's a reason we pay much more for the same drug than other countries. The reason is the American government isn't standing up for the American citizens, and these corporations own the government, and that's why. So yes, this is the whole thrust, really, of why I'm running for president.
Thanks so much. And as Americans abroad, of course, we understand and appreciate good healthcare, and this is something we're really very committed to pushing as well. So we really appreciate your thoughts on that. At the beginning of the call, we talked a lot about the work that you're doing in voter mobilization, and you also talked about voter protection. I think for our last question, we'd like to just ask one more voter protection question that's specific to Americans abroad. We have federal legislation that provides some protection for our votes, but it does not go far enough to counter all the challenges that states and the Trump administration are putting in place that really put a stranglehold on our votes. And one of the particular ones is that we are seeing our votes from abroad, 67% of them come via postal mail. And that's largely due to state requirements. And yet postal delivery of ballots is really fraught with problems. USPS does not deliver on time. 50% of the ballots that are thrown out from votes from abroad are thrown out because of postal problems. And so we're wondering, how will you help protect the rights of Americans abroad to vote while helping states ensure that ballots are returned safely?
Well, Julia, obviously, the Republican Party is in the business of trying to prevent people from voting. And therefore, when they put in regulations that make it difficult to vote, and you think that, well, let's just fix this, I'm sure they want to fix it. The answer is actually, no, they don't want to fix it. They want to exacerbate it. And I'm somebody who I think has at least a 10-year history documented of doing everything I can to make sure that everybody has the best possible chance to vote and for that vote to be fully counted. So I guarantee you, my whole thesis has been the fuller the democracy, the better. It's always been, I want every American to have the best possible chance to vote. I really want every American to vote. And I want to make sure that we put in place every protection to make sure that happens. And literally, Next Gen America registered 1.3 million people in 2016. If that's not a guarantee that I take voting seriously, how about 25 million doors asking people to please vote? Or 420 college campuses that Next Gen is on to register and engage people? Or all the other attempts to extend and make fair balloting? Really, I think Next Gen, we're a grassroots organization, but it's explicitly intended to extend the franchise, to make sure that it goes to people who are being shut out. And so any attempt or, any problem with getting people's votes, that's something I've spent a decade on that problem. And the idea that I wouldn't take seriously the votes of people from abroad is completely inconsistent with 10 years and tens of millions of dollars and hundreds of personal hours to try and make sure that those kinds of things get solved.
Well, we really appreciate that. And, we think that what you're doing with Next Gen is just really fantastic. It's exactly in our bailiwick. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to dig into these questions that we care about so much. Before we sign off, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that Tom Steyer's petition is on the Democrats Abroad website at www.democratsabroad.org/Steyer. That's Steyer. And again, democratsabroad.org/Steyer. Mr. Steyer, would you like to add one last word?
Well, I do. I want to thank everyone for being an ambassador abroad for America, because I know that when you're an American abroad, you whether you want to or not, you in effect are a representative of the country. And if we misbehave, people look at you and say, so Julia, you've been separating children from their parents at the border. And I know that this has to have been a tough 3 years for Americans living abroad, because our administration has been disrespectful of our traditional allies and our partners, and has in fact done lots of things that people around the world look at and think, where did America go so wrong? So I want to thank you for being ambassadors for all the rest of us. And I can promise you as president that I will make you proud. That in fact, the way that I will deal with foreign countries is the traditional American way of being value-driven, a good partner, honest, up to our word, and understanding that our success is dependent on our having long cooperative relationships with other countries around the world based on good faith and good intentions. And that your job as ambassadors to the United States will be 1,000,000 times easier and more pleasant, and that we will succeed around the world in doing things that help the United States and everybody else, and we're going back to being the moral leaders of the world.
Well, thanks so much. We really appreciate that final statement. And thank you for joining us. Thanks everyone else for joining us. We look forward to seeing everybody on future candidate calls and at our primary this spring. Amanda, thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tom, and thanks, Julia, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. I hope that you've enjoyed the Global Town Hall with Mr. Steyer as much as I did. A reminder that we'd love to have you to sign Tom Steyer's petition at democratsabroad.org/Steyer. And we'd also love to have your support. It goes a long way. So please do consider visiting democratsabroad.org/donate so that we can continue to bring more events like these to Americans around the world. We'd also love to have your support as a volunteer. Next year is going to be all hands on deck. So sign up at democratsabroad.org/volunteer to get involved. New first-time volunteers are more than welcome. With that, we're going to be ending the call. Thanks again to Mr. Steyer and to all of you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone. Y'all have a great day.